Welcome to Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, where we talk about gospel insights through great stories and help you find entertainment that is both true and beautiful. Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree is part of the Public Square Media network of podcasts that seek to bring an LDS perspective into the public square. I'm your host, Liz Busby. I am a writer of science fiction and fantasy and a reviewer of books and a Latter-day Saint. And with me today is my co-host, Carl.
Hello, everyone. My name is Carl Cranney. I have a PhD in religion, and I like to write on the intersection of religious themes in pop culture.
Great. And we have two guests with us today, Paul and Michael. Can you guys introduce yourself? We'll start with Paul.
Hi, I'm Paul Williams. I am a PhD student at Idaho State University, and I specialize in fantasy and alternate history fiction.
And Michael?
Hello, I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ, and I am a PhD student as well at Brigham Young University, and I'm a blog writer for the Latter-day Saint Geeks.
Today we'll be talking about Arrival, the 2016 film based on the short story Story of Your Life by Ted Chiang. Director Denis Villeneuve won an Oscar for this fantastic look at first contact, language, time, and family relationships. But first we'll do our best book segment, where we each recommend one thing we're watching, reading, or listening to. My recommendation today is a Mormon literature novel I've been reading. It came out last year. It's called A History of Honey Springs by Darren Cousin. It's not my usual thing. It's a slow-paced Western with LDS characters, but it's not necessarily about Mormonism. It just happens to be set in an LDS community. Things happen at church, but it's about the church, which is refreshing. The basic plot line is a young veteran comes home to find out that he's inherited a farm from a distant relative, and this farm is in the middle of a long-standing feud with the neighbors. It reads like a Wendell Berry novel, and it has a really good LDS-specific meet cute at the 2/3 mark. I'm almost done with this book, and I'm really enjoying it. It's very unique among the Mormon novels that I've read, so I highly recommend History of Honey Springs by Darren Cousin. Carl, what have you got for us today?
So I have been neglectful in my consuming of fiction over the past couple of weeks, so I don't actually have anything to recommend, but I did notice a few days ago that the Joseph Smith Papers has released another podcast called Kirtland, City of Revelation. This is their fourth podcast, and they have done really good work before. There's one on the First Vision, one on the Nauvoo Temple, and one on the Priesthood Restoration. And they are all really good and informative podcasts. They usually have about 6 to 8 episodes, about 30 minutes each, with different scholars and historians of the church giving us background and good information on these key points of the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And I am into this one and really enjoying it so far. So I recommend all the Joseph Smith Papers podcasts, but their new one is Kirtland, City of Revelation.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the First Vision one, so I'm going to have to check that. They are high-quality podcasts, well-produced and good content. Paul, what have you got to recommend for us today?
I can't help myself. I've got to do 2 different series. So I'm currently writing a chapter in my dissertation on Orson Scott Card's Tales of Alvin Maker, which is both popular and not. So this is an alternate history, so it's history that works differently or unfolds differently based on church history and U.S. history. And I know this sounds kind of like it could be like a Mormon Narnia, but I promise you it's not. It's actually Carter takes it very seriously. Well, while still weaving church history and everything, he's very much interrogating the myths that underpin both the church and our history as well. And he asks questions like, if we actually believe this happened, what does that look like? So I highly recommend Tales of Alvin Maker, if you can find them. They don't know if they're in print right now. And I've been revisiting Gene Wolfe's Book of the New Sun. I was recently on a discussion with Philip Chase on YouTube. I got to be a part of a discussion he did about the first volume. There's going to be 3 more because there's 1 per volume. And it is some of the best science fantasy I know of. It's very difficult. Book of the New Sun is like if William Faulkner wanted to write a Dying Earth science fantasy series, but combined with G.K. Chesterton and maybe Joseph Campbell, but not really. So very difficult, but so worthwhile. If you power through to the end, the payoff is amazing.
I can second all of that. That it is difficult, it is hard to get through, And the payoff at the end is amazing. I read it as part of PR's top 100 science fiction and fantasy novels. And I just remember reading the first three going, I don't understand this is nonsense. What is going on here? And then at the very end, I was like, oh. So now I feel like I have to go back and reread them now that I know a little bit more about the whole thing. And I think it ties a little bit into our discussion about like cyclical time versus linear time and prophecy and all sorts of good stuff like that. So I can second everything he said about it being amazing, but you got to get through it to get to the amazing part.
Okay, Michael, what have you got for us?
So since this is the year of Sanderson, I decided to take it upon myself to read as much Brandon Sanderson books as possible. Sadly, there's other books that take priority as well. But right now, I've been reading a young adult series called The Reckoners by Brandon Sanderson. What happens in this series is instead of focusing on superheroes saving the day, we see an alternative reality where those who gain superpowers become corrupt and evil. And it takes normal human beings to stop them from being these dictators throughout the world.
It's a really fun series. I love it. It's got some good stuff. Highly recommend The Reckoners.
Sounds a lot to me like my favorite graphic novel, which is The Dark Knight Returns, where Batman decides that he has to kill Superman to make the world politically make sense. And it's brilliant. Because Batman's just a guy. He's like, all right, Clark, let's do this. And it's really fun. So anyway.
Yeah, with the first book, like Steelheart is supposed to be like Superman. He's basically invincible. He has only one weakness, but you try and figure out what his weakness is. And yeah, and you just see what happens as you read the book.
Okay, we'll have links to all these recommendations on our website, popcultureapricottree.com, and buying through those links helps support the podcast so we can keep bringing you conversations about the true and the beautiful in pop culture. We also wanted to shout out a recent episode from one of our fellow Public Square Media podcasts, only in this case, not a podcast. I wanted to shout out a recent article on Public Square Magazine. We haven't had a chance to get to an episode on Star Wars Andor, despite many guests asking when we're going to do it. But Public Square Magazine released an article recently on Andor, and it's called Andor, A Journey Through the Ethics of Positivism. And it analyzes the bureaucratic nature of an evil empire in Andor. And it brings in C.S. Lewis's space trilogy, so you know I'm here for it. So you can find that link on our website to Public Square Magazine. And now we're on to our main discussion about Arrival. Oh, I had forgotten how good this movie was, and when I went to rewatch it, when it ended, I just stood up and like you do on the theater in opening night. Like, it was so good, and it is just such a well-done science fiction film that is also a very artistic film. How do you guys feel about Arrival?
So I remember when I first saw Arrival, so that was the end of my first semester of grad school, and I met up with an old friend in Idaho Falls, and we went and saw it together. And I just remember being absorbed. I knew nothing about it. I didn't know that there was a novella or anything. I just heard it was about aliens and first contact, and language was a part of it. Cool, whatever. And it just sounded interesting. So we went and saw it, and I was just enthralled. There was enough of a hook to carry me through, not having any idea what was going to unfold. And I just remember the moment that I started figuring it out, when the main characters are figuring it out. And I had just finished all these courses on linguistic theory because grad school. And so it kind of cascaded in my brain, and I just stood there in awe. And I remember the lights came up, and some people behind me, some patrons behind me, I heard one of them go, "I didn't get it." And a part of me wanted to just like spin around and say, "What is wrong with you?" I did not do that. But this movie has stuck with me. This alone made me a bit of a Denis Villeneuve fan. And the last time was the first time I rewatched it because I wanted to preserve that experience in my memory. But yeah, I think it holds up incredibly well. I think that it is incredibly compelling and very smart.
So this was my first time rewatching it as well. It reminds me of an M. Night Shyamalan movie in that there is this underlying thing that once you understand it, you go back and rewatch the movie, and the movie means something completely different. And I thought it was very well crafted and it holds up remarkably well. There are a lot of good questions that we can ask, and I'm sure we will. And it put Denis Villeneuve on the map for me as well. And he's now one of those people that I will just go watch anything that he does because he's earned it.
So I actually read the book before watching the movie. I didn't even know that Arrival was related to the story of your life for the longest time. And then when I finally made that connection, I was like, I read the book. I don't need to watch the movie. The book, like everyone says, the book's better than the movie. So there's no point of me watching the movie. So I waited years. So I never had that in theater experience. But then when I decided to watch the movie, I was like, this is a masterpiece. This is well done. Not only does it get all the themes that the book was trying to share with you, it also gives you a different perspective. It just plays so well with, it adds to what the book doesn't have. So instead, like the book, you can say it's a masterpiece on its own, and you can relate that the movie is its own masterpiece. There's definitely connections between the two, but they're also separate. And also time travel is like one of the best things to think about in my free time. If time travel was a theme, how would it play out? And yeah, I just love any shows, movies, or books that dive into this theory or this subject.
I encountered the movie first and read the novella later, but this may be one of the few examples where the book and the movie are equally good. And I can think of this and The Princess Bride. And the one example where the movie is better than the book, I think, is Jurassic Park. But this is like one of those few times where both of them are really worth your time to experience.
Yeah, in such very different ways. They're just both really artistic masterpieces. One thing that really struck me this time around that I don't think I noticed the first time I watched it was the opening scene where she's in the class and people start getting calls on their phone. And just that moment where they say, turn the TV to a news channel. From then on, it goes for like 10 minutes without showing us the aliens ever. It's just showing the people reacting to the news. And as someone who was in high school when 9/11 happened, like it brought back all these memories of don't show it on the TV. And just that watching the reaction more than we're watching the news. And it gave me that kind of eerie feeling. And I felt like the movie is very smart playing with our bias that we feel like if aliens show up, then we know what kind of movie this is going to be. We know it's going to be a violent, defend the earth movie. And then it turns out not to be that. And so it plays with us very smartly with this. We expect that's going to happen, and then it doesn't.
Certainly a very slow-paced movie in some ways, not as slow-paced as something like, say, 2001, but it's a very contemplative movie. There's just a lot going on, and if you came expecting Independence Day, you're going to be really disappointed.
Yeah, my kids wandered in during part of the movie, and they thought the aliens were cool when they were on screen, but then the long shots of just silence and thinking about things didn't work so good for a child audience.
I would add, I think that it's a very deliberate movie, right? I think that movies that are made just to be made, which in the conveyor belt of film production that we live in, that happens a lot, where it's just, okay, like what can we do to keep the adrenaline pumping, to keep the audience's attention wrenched in place? And Villeneuve, he's very methodical about what he's doing. And it makes sense that he would do a good job for a Ted Chiang story, because this is one of those few people who will get shortlisted for a Hugo or a Nebula Award and will ask to be removed because he himself does not feel that particular story is at a high enough standard for it. He has incredible integrity. I think that Denis Villeneuve, similarly, has high integrity as an artist in that respect, without being a jerk about it. And like Ted, I've been in an elevator with Ted Chiang. He's a regular at a conference I go to, and he is just a sweet guy. Like he is so just nice.
It's really cool. This is my jealous face.
Yeah. I'll see you next week, actually. Same conference next week in Florida.
Here you go. Say hi to him and tell him we loved his book.
Will do.
We should just dive right into the moral messaging or the philosophy and theology of this film, because I think it's right there on the surface. This is not something you have to dig for at all in this movie. Obviously, the most interesting aspect is this circular time aspect, I think. And it reminded me of C.S. Lewis's analogy of how do we conceptualize God as being outside time? Maybe God is the author of the book and he can read the whole book, but we are the characters in the book and can't see what that is, which is an imperfect analogy, but it felt in the movie at that moment at the end where she suddenly is able to have the knowledge that she will have later and bring that in to the point where she is, as though she can read the whole book at once and is now outside of the narrative. Imperfect metaphor for God, for sure, but that's what that reminded me of.
And let's just be clear, as a professional theologian, the four of us are not going to solve the question about whether God's omniscience impacts our free will in the next 20 minutes here on this podcast.
Come on, what if we give it 30?
Okay, maybe we can do it in 30. The thing that the movie really brought home for me was this interesting question of what she says towards the end. If you could see things from start to finish, would you do something different? Because the question really to her becomes, should I have this child knowing that the child is going to die at the age of 12? That is a really interesting moral question to ask yourself. Would you want to have a child knowing that the child is going to die of cancer very young? And knowing that outcome in some ways gives you more moral agency, because now you're choosing, I don't know, I don't even know how to explain that, but you have more options available. If it's not a mystery what's going to happen, then when you choose it, you're really choosing it. And that is a powerful sort of scenario. I'm just reminded of some friends of mine who had a child who had a genetic defect, and they knew the child was not going to survive much beyond birth. And I think their daughter lived 2 or 3 weeks. And it was just the sweetest little experience for their family, bringing this child into the world and knowing that they were basically there to give her a body, and then she was going to literally shuffle off her mortal coil and move on to the next stage of her existence. And it was something that touched all of us in that ward very deeply. And I became aware, like, that there are Catholic organizations that knit blankets for children who are going to be born with genetic defects that are not going to survive very long. And this whole network of people that is exceptionally, I'll call it pro-life in all of the really good senses, around these children of God who are coming here in these very tragic, in some ways, circumstances. But to see the beauty of that, I was just forcefully reminded of that by watching this movie, and her decision to have this child, even knowing what the ultimate outcome of that decision was going to be, both for her marriage and for the child's life itself.
I knew that the death was like supposed to be the kicker, or like the hard thing to accept for Louise Banks in the movie. But to me, what was more traumatic was the husband leaving her. Because like in the church, we are taught that families are eternal. And not saying that death is not sad, it is sad. But for eternity, we're going to be with that person forever. But the choice of leaving your spouse, to me, is more traumatic. Maybe it's because like in my family history, we see the Davenport line. We see a lot of divorce happening through that line until my dad finally decided, I don't want a divorce because I know what it was like. So he kept with his marriage. And then we see in this movie where Louise Banks separated from Ian. And to me, that was more traumatic because, and if I knew the future, if I saw the future and I saw, oh, me and my wife would be separated because of my actions, I would do everything in my power to change the future so that we wouldn't be separated.
Yeah.
I mean, and that's the question. Does she have the agency to change it? Or is she, to use another character from science fiction and fantasy who can see outside of time, Dr. Manhattan, who says, we're all puppets, I'm just the only one who can see the strings. And so it doesn't really wrestle or answer the question whether she actually has agency now in this world, but I agree with you entirely. If I knew that my actions were going to lead to a negative outcome, I would try to change them, which is why the dying of the child is such a tragic moment, because there's nothing she can do about that. But she could have told Ian before they decided to have the baby that this was going to be the outcome, because that non-communication, that betrayal, is what causes their ultimate divorce. And I wonder what would have happened if she had said, all right, we can have a baby, but just so you know, I can see outside of time now, and the child's going to die when she's 12. from this really rare disease. And would he then decide to have the child too? It's just a very interesting and different question, a sort of what if. But we don't know if she is a puppet that can see the strings or if she actually has agency. That question is never answered.
It's true. But I think like even if you have a perspective of any future, like even if you can't control it, wouldn't you want to try to make it the best future possible? Wouldn't you want to try to make your marriage last?
The thing that it reminds me of is, did you guys watch House, the TV show? There's the character 13 who knows that Huntington's disease is in her family and that she has a 50% chance of having it. And one of the major conflict arcs between her and House is that House is like, there's a simple blood test. You could find out if you have it or not. And she's like, I don't want to know. And this is a real life thing that like in the 80s, they thought, oh, we'll develop this blood test and it'll be great. People can know they have this fatal disease that they're going to die when they're 30. And then they invented the test, and 95% of people who are at a 50-50 chance of having this disease don't find out. They don't want to know. And so I feel like that's what broke the marriage, is that Ian not knowing and then finding out that she knew and didn't tell him. This knowledge breaks something inside us, knowing our mortality. It takes a strong person to keep going in spite of knowing their mortality. And we as humans resist that knowledge. We don't actually want the knowledge of when we're going to die.
Doesn't it give us a great appreciation for Jesus Christ? Because he knew he was going to be put on the cross and suffer in the Garden of Gethsemane, and yet he still chose to go with it. He still had his agency and he went with it.
I want to add another wrinkle. One important thing to go maybe in tandem with all that is the fact that we see that she is still allowing herself to feel the tragedy of the situation. She's not trying to rush to it. She's not trying to rush past it. She is allowing it to be. And I think that's one of the really amazing things when you know what's actually going on and you see the opening montages of her, and when they find out that her daughter is dying and she just breaks down. And so I think that there's something really powerful about that. But then just as Liz was giving that example from House, I think I want to add a different thing. I don't know. I think, yes, the mortality thing is a part of what destroyed the marriage. But this whole movie is very much about the challenge of human connectivity, interpersonal connectivity, and barriers and vulnerability. And the fact that she has failed to meet her husband on that level, the fact that she has withheld stuff from him. It's not just the fact that she didn't tell him our child will die, but the fact that she had a secret of any sort that she withheld, and let alone a secret that does affect them both deeply.
So the reason we're doing Arrival is because this is the 1-year anniversary of the podcast. And there was a podcast that had Meg Connolly, who's a former member of the church, talking about this movie. And she made the comparison that Louise is like Eve because she's the one who has the knowledge first. And in this case, it's almost like Eve chose to not tell Adam about this problem. And then that causes that separation between them, right? Instead of being like, hey, I've done this. We need to be together in this. She's like, I'm going to protect you from this problem and not tell you about it. That's all off screen. So this is all conjecture, but it's an interesting problem to work with.
I would note that it's not all Louise's fault. Ian decided to leave too. I think the movie makes that clear that he chose to leave and he couldn't handle it. And he ruined that father-daughter relationship. Even though it was going to end, he chose to leave.
Huh, people are complicated. Weird.
It turns out humans.
I don't know if I can necessarily blame him. That's a pretty heavy thing to get dropped on you. Oh, by the way, your wife can now see the past, present, and future all at the same time, and your daughter's going to die when you're 12, and she didn't tell you. That's a lot.
Let's say they separate when she tells him when she's 8 years old. That's 4 years you're missing out on your daughter's life.
That's true. It's true.
Yeah. It's hard to have that kind of perspective, though. Another book this reminded me of is the memoir When Breath Becomes Air by Paul Kalanithi. I don't know if you guys have read that. He was in his residency to become a neurosurgeon and a researcher, and then was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. And he's a beautiful writer. This memoir is wonderful. I have reread it several times just because it is the most life-giving book about dying that I've ever read. And I love this quote that he says, "Before my cancer was diagnosed, I knew that someday I would die, but I didn't know when. After the diagnosis, I knew that someday I would die, but I didn't know when. But now I knew it acutely. The fact of death is unsettling. There's no other way to live." But it can be hard when you're brought to that confrontation. And there's a reason that a lot of marriages do break up when kids get cancer and when kids die, because that is a hard thing to go through, to look death in the face. It takes a lot of spiritual searching to be able to handle that kind of thing. So I don't know that there's like a blame. This is like a typical human problem, I think.
True, I shouldn't have used blame.
I mean, we'd like to think that our knowledge of the plan of salvation would give us hope and fortify us against tragedy, but tragedy is still tragedy, and you're welcome to have your own personal emotional reactions to that. And you have to still choose the right thing, as Michael has pointed out, but let's cut people some slack. Maybe we all should aspire to be like that family from my old ward who had the child with the genetic problem. They handled it beautifully, and is an example that I should hope we would all follow. Can I just say that it is weird that two of the most pro-life movies that I've seen in the past couple of years are both alien invasion movies? Because there's this one, and then there's A Quiet Place where they decide to have a child despite the fact that the slightest sound is going to get them all killed, but they decide to have a child anyway. That's really interesting to me.
There's so many problems which are easier to talk about through sci-fi, I feel like.
Yes.
That's one of the advantages of sci-fi fantasy, because if you make a pro-life film, then you're making a statement. But if it, in a fantasy or a sci-fi film, it's somehow softened and detached from our current political tensions so that people can actually process ideas with a little less bias, maybe. Not always, but I feel like it's one of the tools of sci-fi fantasy. Obviously, the other interesting thing in this film is the language barrier and trying to figure out how to speak to a species that is just like completely not just a language that no one speaks, but like a mode of language that no one uses. When my kids walked in and I tried to give them the summary to catch them up so that they could understand what was going on, I was like, how would you translate an alien language that nobody had ever spoken before? And they were just like, oh, mind blown, trying to figure out how you would do this. The linguistics in this film is not completely accurate, but it does deal with some really interesting linguistics concepts, I feel like.
That's something that I really like about this movie, is that it tries to show the truly alien. What happens if aliens really come make contact to us and they speak in pheromone, right? Like there was a short story I read once about the ants who are like trying to communicate with these huge creatures that keep walking around above them. They're like, I don't know, man. I've been screaming pheromones at them all day long and they don't respond. These things must not be intelligent. Like, so often we get Star Trek, they're just humans with different foreheads, right?
And we'll calculate on our universal translator and it'll be fine.
Yeah. And we understand that Star Trek, especially the original series, was operating under certain budgetary constraints, but this is one of the movies where they really tried to say, what would a completely different alien species be like? And that makes it so interesting to try to get into the mindset of communicating with other people. And I use the term people, the other intelligent beings, because as the movie points out, we have a hard enough time communicating amongst each other, and we're all humans. So good luck when the heptapods show up.
I think that one thing that it usefully expresses is the fact that if communication is going to happen, there has to be a point that brings us together. In other words, if the aliens are going to come and if they're going to try and communicate, communication itself will still function. There are certain core mechanics, and the actual expressions of those mechanics are going to change. I'm a structuralist and an narratologist, bread and butter, and so I'm all about like how like there's inherent systems that we just learn how to play upon. And so again, it's even though the heptapods have a very non-human way of expressing things, they are still operating by a degree of grammar, right? I love that scene when Louise is trying to say, if we're going to try and ask them this question, I need to find out how do they do these things? How do they express desire versus this versus that? And I appreciate the fact that it creates this leveling effect, even no matter how different the actual means of communication change.
It's interesting to think through that. And the way that Dr. Ian's science and her linguistics kind of work together. And it's, can we use math? And we're going to use linguistics principles and all these things working together. I love that. As someone who's studied both English and chemistry, seeing both of those working together was really fun for me.
Beyond that, right, it's the fact that math and language are basic, or rather math is a form of language, or language is a form of math. It's one eternal round in that respect, right?
Literally, in this case, one eternal round.
Is that why everything was drawn in circles?
Yeah. It is interesting, that circle motif. And I loved the idea, too, that the Chinese scientists have communicated to the aliens through mahjong. It reminded me of that Player of Games book that I just finished reading that Carl recommended several episodes ago, but like how you can communicate through things other than language, and game is one of them, but that constrains your communication in some ways, that it's always going to be adversarial, that everything I get, you didn't get. It's a fight.
Yeah. Brian Atterbury, a scholar of fantasy and a member of my dissertation committee, has a new book out called Fantasy, How It Works. And he has a whole chapter about challenging the question of conflict. Because, you go into a creative writing class, and they're going to tell you a story needs conflict in order for it to be a story. And he's trying to parse out, does it have to be that way? Or do we have to call it conflict? Are there other ways of creating narrative tension and dramatic effect without needing to give a narrative framework that inevitably devolves into war, suffering, bloodshed, and so forth?
And it's so easy for us to accept that in American pop culture, because that is like the standard format of our movies, right? It's like a Marvel movie, it has to have violence. It has to end in a violent way.
Yeah.
Because it is a conflict-based movie.
And it's so boring now.
I think we have reached saturation on the Marvel movie formula for sure.
But you just bring up all good points about how trying to learn a different language, and I'm not sure I believe the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, at least the really strong form that this movie and the novella both lean into just as an artifact to make the story work and ask the questions it wants to ask. But I do remember something a friend of mine once said, I like Spanish better because the world is prettier in Spanish. And I thought that was really interesting. And it just reminds me so much of how it is difficult as somebody who can play around a little bit in the original Greek to look at what the New Testament that we're studying this year and the things that they were trying to convey, the testimony they were trying to express to their audience about the Lord Jesus Christ, and now us removed from their culture by 2,000 years and their language by several degrees. We all read the King James Bible itself, which is itself 400 years old in English and was itself trying to ape earlier translations of English. And it's just trying to get at the testimony through the barrier of language. It's the barrier and also the medium of the testimony is just really interesting and is something that we're never quite going to master, which is why I think it's important to have the Spirit just teach you directly, because that's why I think we have the Spirit in large part to convey things to us, like it says in John 14:26.
Add into that, when they're trying to discover or find a medium between communicating with each other, since I was doing this podcast, I was rewatching it, I was like, what's the gospel message here at this scene? And I thought that this could be compared to communicating with Heavenly Father when we pray. I think Heavenly Father could understand us, but do we understand what He wants us to do? And we see that we can get revelation from reading the scriptures. Sometimes it's a burning of the bosom. And we each have different ways of how the Spirit communicates with us. And we just have to, and it takes a lifetime to understand how the Spirit communicates. Sometimes we start off small by just a simple yes or no. Should I do this or should I not? And then can we develop that yes or no communication with Heavenly Father to something more? To something where when we read the scriptures or when we have an impression, we know that this is the Father's will, that this is what Heavenly Father wants us to do at this time.
I'm embarrassed to say I am a professional geek and a professional theologian, And I did not make the connection of trying to talk to these creatures that see outside of time and space and understand their intentions towards us and compare that to how we try to talk with God, who we believe similarly exists outside of time. Maybe not space. I don't know. There's mixed signals on that in Latter-day Saint theology. I'm embarrassed to say I didn't make that connection until right now, and now I need to go rewatch the movie again because that's got some interesting stuff to think of. Because we believe, right? It talks about when you go to heaven, you will receive a white stone. There's a new name written on it, and we think it's a Urim and Thummim, and it allows you to see past, present, and future. So we think it's going to be like Doctor Who, like, welcome to heaven. Here's your TARDIS. But it might be, welcome to heaven. Now you can speak heptapod.
Yeah. And I wonder also this analogy of that they say in the movie, if you only give them a hammer, then everything looks like a nail. Do we offer God these things where we say, it's either this or this? And God is, but no, it's option 3, 5, 7 over here that you are not allowing for in your conceptual framework. And I feel like so much of our spiritual work is to figure out how to get ourselves into a place where we can conceptualize things in a different way. Like you were saying about the scriptures earlier, there's so much that gets lost in the culture, in the language. I substitute taught for gospel doctrine twice this year, and I keep hammering home this point that the King James translation happened at the same time as Shakespeare. And if you wouldn't feel comfortable picking up Shakespeare without any footnotes and just reading it and thinking you understand it, then you shouldn't do the same thing with the King James Bible because the words have changed. They are different. And the cultural context is different. And God's meaning through that culture and then through our culture, it's just a really big, long game of telephone sometimes, I feel like. So I just finished reading another book that talks about this, which is Misreading Scripture Through Western Eyes, which talks about the cultural assumptions that are behind the words written in the scriptures that we think we understand, that we totally don't understand. Things like we're very individualist in the West, and then cultures who wrote the Bible were much more collectivist. And we're much more based on individual conscience and guilt, and they are based on a culture of shame and group conscience. And just all different things, even like literary techniques. Like Paul has a lot of lists of 5 things. And why does he do that? Because that was the number of things in a list. Now we usually do 3, like your 3 points in your 5-paragraph essay. That is the number that we pick when we list things. And Paul picks 5 because that was the number they picked. It's not because there are 5 of these things. It's because you pick 5. Because it's a writing technique. And we don't even realize that. So yeah, there's so many layers that this can go through. And it's a good thing that we have the article of faith that, as far as it is translated correctly, and as far as we can translate it correctly, and as far as we understand it correctly.
Paul, I cut you off, so go ahead.
You heartless villain.
Now we have to leave that in.
We're going to totally leave that in.
Please do. No, so I wanted to add, because I think ever since I got home from my mission, or I guess during my mission, I have been really fascinated with the way Revelation works. And I'm not going to pretend that I know everything about the issue remotely, but I'm thinking about, in relation to what we're talking about right now, I'm thinking about one is in the Bible dictionary, in the entry on prayer, it says prayer is the means by which the will of the child and the will of the parent are brought into correspondence with each other. And most of the problems related to prayer are the result of having forgotten this key relationship. So I am on the autism spectrum. And this is a fairly recent discovery on my part, just in the last few years in grad school. And so I depend upon other people coming around to eventually recognize that there is a neurological barrier between me and them, and I cannot fully articulate things to them, nor am I going to fully understand what they articulate to me. And so it requires legwork on both parts to do some heavy lifting to accommodate those differences. And think about how that relates to Heavenly Father. Like my worst prayers are the list kind or the rambling kind. Harold B. Lee has an amazing BYU devotional called Prayer, where he talks about talking with God, and that we just need to emphasize this element of that type of relationship with him. And I'm thinking then about in section 121, verse 45 and 46, where it tells us to virtue thoughts unceasingly and the household of faith. And then it says that the doctrine of the priesthood will descend upon your soul like the dews from heaven, and without compulsory means will flow unto you. And I think that, and what I'm trying to relate here is this element of how if we do the work to facilitate communication, we can allow that into ourselves. And so many of the problems, at least that I observe as someone who teaches writing to first-year students in college, is this insistence upon fixed meaning of words. I said it, therefore it means that. No, I want you to figure out how to use flexible language that can, and in a way that it crystallizes for the reader, and the reader will choose to receive it in this way. Because what have Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and everything else in social media done to language is they have trivialized while also concretizing language into this ugly, plastic explosive of a thing that destroys so much because we're so reckless with it.
I love that image. I'm going to steal that.
I totally invented it just now.
Feels like 1984 out there sometimes on social media, where it's like, this word you think means one thing does not mean this thing anymore. Now it means this thing. And you better know that.
Or you will get canceled.
Or you will get canceled. Or you'll be saying something that you don't know what it means. And just this policing of language that is a little bit problematic, I feel. And it's not relationship focused, like you were saying. Like, we're not focused on having a relationship. Your language has to stand up to any random person on the internet who knows nothing about you and makes no allowances for who you are and your background and any kind of relationship with you. And language can't do that. Language breaks under those circumstances, and it has. See our whole episode on Black Mirror.
Yes, exactly.
More discussion of social media.
So I kind of want to go back to Carl's point when he was talking about the Urim and Thummim, or at least the white stone mentioned in section 130. Because, again, I'm writing a chapter right now in my dissertation on Orson Scott Card, and so I've been revisiting his article. He has a letter to the editor he wrote to Dialogue back in 84, I think, called SFN Religion. And he has this, it's an amazing line, I think, where he talks about how, to his mind, the audacity of the restored gospel is that we are claiming to have rationalized and naturalized divinity itself. And in many ways, again, Ted Chiang himself is an atheist. Like, if you read his endnotes in the book, he shares, like, people make these claims. I'm just not convinced by them. And I really appreciate how congenial he is about that. Again, he's a very nice guy. But Chiang is himself arguing that you can still tap into these metaphysical principles through science fiction that then we, as believers, we just take it and run with it. And we graft the gospel onto these things and these things upon the gospel, and we go back and forth. Because what we're really just trying to do is figure out, if we're going to claim certain things, what is that like after all at the end of the day? And what are the implications of that?
Yeah, I think there is a long tradition and a current tradition of Latter-day Saint writers of science fiction and fantasy for this reason, that we're always trying to work this out. I'm working on a paper right now that's talking about Mormons writing aliens. So probably this is going to come into it a bit, talking about how we believe that essentially they're going to be comprehensible because they're like us, because they're children of God, which is interesting. But Ted Chiang is interesting in that he does use a ton of religious symbols in his books. He's got that Tower of Babel story.
That thing is amazing. I love that story.
I like better than that one. I like the one with the Jewish philosophers and the golems that they're making.
Yeah, I've got 72 letters.
Yeah, that one is fantastic. And then the one with the angels.
Oh, yeah.
He uses religious symbols really effectively for someone who is not a believer, which I find is rare.
He takes it seriously and does it the dignity it deserves, but then, because he's not a believer, allows himself to play with it. And that is a really interesting combination, and it works excellently.
The author doesn't necessarily have to be a believer for a book to work for you. Like, case in point, his Dark Materials trilogy by Philip Pullman, which he wrote explicitly to be the anti-Narnia. And me, as a middle schooler, LDS kid reading it, thinking, a fortunate fall, what's the problem? This totally makes sense. This is LDS theology. This is great. Totally not what Philip Pullman intended in any way.
Yeah, I was severely disappointed by reading that when I read that for the first time because I was like, oh, I see what you were going for, but I'm a Latter-day Saint and your arrows just fly right by me because it doesn't matter. I don't have the same assumptions about God, so neener, neener.
Is that how Samuel felt when he was on top of the wall? Neener, neener, neener.
Yeah, he's probably a little more Christ-like about it than I was when I read His Dark Materials trilogy.
I was 12 when I read Ursula Le Guin's The Tombs of Adawan, and like it increased my testimony. Like I was just trying to develop my testimony. Like, yeah, apostasy. This is a thing, right? Religions begin, they get corrupted. It's a thing, right? And then when I was in grad school and I told Dr. Atterbury, who is the world's #1 Le Guin scholar, that, and he just looked at me so confused. Wait, that one increased your faith? He was very baffled by that.
It helps to be a Latter-day Saint where we can fill this liminal space where we don't fit, like you said, Carl, many of the assumptions that are made about what religion has to be in a Western context. Where you say, yeah, we're gonna take a nuanced part of that. And yeah, corruption in a church, we expect that. That's apostasy. We have that as part of our doctrine. It happens all the time. Brandon Sanderson's books almost universally have corrupt churches in them, but they also have a truth, which is interesting. So we'll move on to our rating segment, and we give each movie 3 ratings. The first one is for content, clean versus objectionable material. Would you want your children or your grandma to watch this with you? We give it a rating of celestial, terrestrial, telestial, outer darkness. There's not a ton of objectionable content in this movie. I believe there's one F word.
Yes.
Where would you guys rate this? Michael, you want to start us off?
Sure. Just because that one F word, like there's tons of people that I know that won't watch any movies with any swear words, especially if it's the F word. So if they only watch celestial movies, then I would say that this is probably terrestrial. But besides from that, if you're fine with that one F word, then this is a celestial movie.
Paul?
Yeah,
thoughts?
I think I have a similar mind to Michael. I am far more Gentile about those kinds of issues than most people would be. I'm kind of like, I don't care. I would be more concerned about just like kids or other people getting bored by the movie because they're not going to be operating on that level. So I want to say celestial because I think it's a very compelling movie in that respect.
Yeah, I'm going to give it terrestrial as well. There are very tense moments. There is a weight and a gravitas when everything's falling apart and the different nations stop talking to each other and we think it's going to be World War III or maybe it's going to turn into Independence Day and we don't really know. And she's trying to get the colonel on board and he's, nope, sorry, it didn't work. And there's lots of very tense moments in the movie as well, which isn't necessarily objectionable material, but there is a weight to this movie that I would make sure that people understood going in, because if you expected Independence Day or something like that, you are going to have a bad time. If you expected 2001: A Space Odyssey, then you might have a better time. So I'd give it terrestrial.
I think I'll give it celestial with some very selective muting. Just muted that one scene. I feel like the tension here is a lot less than a lot of movies, just because it moves very slowly and will pass over the heads of children. It's not like direct violence most of the time, which is a refreshing change. Most alien movies are pretty violent.
Need to get back to E.T.
Yeah, E.T. level.
Right.
Yes.
But this is not a children's movie.
No, it's definitely not a children's movie. I think you have to have people who are able to engage with the concepts more and able to handle the silence and the contemplative nature of it. And the fact that the movie is purposefully being disorienting at some points, like filming shots upside down and sideways and cutting back to things that you don't know where they're happening. But it's part of the charm of the movie. It's part of what it is. So yeah, that's where that is. Our next rating is for artistic merit on a scale of 1 to 5 popcorn balls. I'm just going to give this 5 and then pass it off to Paul.
Awesome. I'm going to give it like a 4.75, rounded to 5, because there is one gross inaccuracy in this movie that must be addressed, which is there is absolutely no way that a single income linguistics professor in Montana affords a house that cool.
This is true. Unfair expectations for humanities majors. That's what this problem is in this movie.
Yes. Yeah. But otherwise, the movie is pretty freaking amazing. My only other critique of it is, last night I was like, I don't know if I could watch this movie more than every 5 years. Like, it's not even like a rigorous movie. There's a certain demand that it puts upon you that does reduce it in that respect. But it's a hair's breadth issue, in my opinion.
Carl, what about you?
5 popcorn balls. I'm always amused when we're dealing with something like aliens or superheroes. And a good example is the first Captain America movie, where my wife and I are completely on board with there being alien artifacts and Nazi super scientists and super soldier serums and things like that. But the moment that the girl wears a pantsuit and has a gun on the front lines, we're like, nope, that would never have happened in World War II. That's not a thing. And here we have aliens coming to teach us their language so that we can think outside of time. And the big objection that we come up with is that her house is too nice. I give it 5 popcorn balls. It's just an amazing movie. It draws me in. The rewatch made it more rewarding. And now that we've had this conversation, I'm sure my rewatch is going to be even more rewarding. There's just so much depth and so many layers to this thing that director Denis Villeneuve is just doing really wonderful stuff, and it's so thoughtful, and it's a great movie. 5 popcorn balls.
And Michael, you finish us up?
I would also give it 5 popcorn balls because of the ability to be able to rewatch it and see it in different light each time you rewatch it. Like the first time we watch it, you think it's the timeline's consistent or linear. And then at the end, you see that she's actually seeing the future. And so you watch it again and the hints towards the future each time. Like in the first scene that she has a wedding ring on, but then the next scene you see her in the present, she does have a wedding ring. So just a little like autistic skills that they use, and is perfect.
Yeah, it's just so well done. Very much feels like a person made this film and not a committee. It feels like someone had a vision and they executed it, and not like we needed to make a movie to fill this slot. And our final rating is for gospel connections and morally edifying messages on a scale from 1 to 5 apricots. Carl, you want to start with that one?
We have this ongoing thing where I don't want to give it 5 apricots unless there's an explicit gospel connection. But this movie had so many good moral messages and things to wrestle with. And again, I've called it one of the great pro-life movies of the past few years because of this really interesting question of, would you have a child, knowing that they were going to die young from some incurable disease? I'm going to give it 5 apricots, especially now that I have to go back and think about trying to communicate with heptapods and put that in my cap to think about how we try to communicate with God. I'm going to give it 5 apricots. There's just a lot here, and you can draw on it. Maybe we'll think of it like as the book of Esther or something. There isn't an explicit mention of God, but it is in the scriptures, and you can draw some cool stuff out of it. So we'll go with that.
There you go. Michael, what do you think?
I'd give it 5 apricots as well. There's just so many gospel messages you can take, even though the author wasn't an atheist. He's very respectful when he wrote the book. I feel like he, instead of making fun of us believers, he tries to make connections. And there's themes that we can take away from it, such as pro-life, such as communicating with God, and so many others as well.
Paul, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm going to go with 5 because basically just to rephrase what Carl and Michael have said, right? I'm thinking about what Roland Barthes said. He said that where reader and text meet, writing happens. And I don't think that this movie is exactly a gospel-oriented or even a theologically oriented text. But I think that it is produced in a way that touches upon themes that, at least within our theology, we can easily map those upon it. I don't know if I would call it a pro-life movie, but I think that it is very possible to derive a pro-life message from it. And it's very easy to derive a very cosmological, theological, divinity-oriented message from it, and so forth and so on.
And I'm going to give it 5 apricots as well. I'm just going to say that I don't think you can watch this movie and not have a conversation about it. It is one of those films where you need to talk about it to process the movie when you're done. It means it's very good art, for sure, to me. Like something that makes you want to discuss it and, like you said, write and think is a great thing to be consuming and to be sharing with people around you. So this is a great movie across the board. Michael, where can people find you and your writing online?
So you can find us on latterdaysaintgeeks.com, where we post blogs every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. You can find us on Facebook and Instagram under Latter-day Saint Geeks.
Yep, and they have such fun blog posts. If there's a geek property out there that you like, they've probably written something about it. They're great. So highly recommend following. Paul, where can people find you or get a hold of you?
Yeah, so I am on Facebook, or you can email me at paulwilliams@isu.edu. That's about the extent of my presence.
It's great. And Carl?
I'm on Twitter at Carl Cranney.
And you can follow my writing and book reviews at lizbusby.com. Thanks for joining us this week. If you've enjoyed this episode, please leave a like or review on the podcast platform of your choice. Subscribe and follow us on social media so you can enjoy future episodes. And recommend the podcast to someone who you watch movies with. Carl, can you tell us what we're going to be doing in our next episode?
Absolutely. Next time, we'll be discussing Darren Aronofsky's new film, The Whale. Brendan Fraser received a Best Actor nomination for his performance as an overweight English teacher who is estranged from his daughter. The film is rated R, so we want to give a note of caution to our more sensitive audience members. If you go to Common Sense Media to see what the content is in the movie, it's got all the content. Lots of things that people might find objectionable. I haven't seen this yet, but I really like Darren Aronofsky's work, and I was so moved by the trailer that I was like, we got to do an episode on this one. But I haven't seen it, and from the reports, there's a lot of stuff that might be objectionable, but I am really looking forward to seeing this when it's available for rental on streaming platforms in a couple of days here. So be ready for that conversation in our next episode. Maybe I sold that a little too harsh, but it's going to be good.
It's going to be good. This has been Pop Culture on the Apricot Tree, encouraging you to seek after everything virtuous, lovely, of good report, or praiseworthy. See you next time.